Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another one of our live episodes of The Breakdown. It is Sunday, September 11th, and we've got a whole lot to talk about tonight. Not only have there obviously been some interesting developments in the land of federal politics in the last, 24 hours or so, and we're going to have Deirdre Mitchell-McLean tap in to walk us through what happened, the implications, and where to get your doomsday bunkers. But we've also got a lot that's been going on in Alberta politics, and that's our bread and butter. So that's what we're going to get into right away. As always, we're going to try to start things off with a little bit of a lighter note. So. Boy, this is going to be a hard pivot right here, because to start with, obviously, there's been a lot of conversation about the fact that the Queen passed away earlier this week. There's a lot of people who have a lot of very strong and complex feelings about this. Obviously, the Queen is the monarch, was the monarch of Canada. We have a king now, I'm told. But secondary to that, there's a lot of complications that go on in regards to the monarchy and what the monarchy has done, not only in Canada, but worldwide as well. Certainly, we've seen a lot of countries that were, quite frankly, the victims of the British Empire. They've been expressing some strong opinions about that, and some people have some problems with that. Some people don't. But one person who was absolutely devastated and issued a public statement saying as much was none other than the Premier, Jason Kenney. He released a public statement where he talked about the impact of the Queen and all of the wonderful things and how Alberta recognizes the Queen. And he went so far as to invoke the mountain in Alberta that is named after, well, not the Queen. It turns out on closer examination that a bunch of news agencies actually had to delete a bunch of tweets where they had referenced Mr. Kenney's statements about Mount Queen Elizabeth. And unfortunately, what it really comes down to is it's Elizabeth with an S, not a Z. It was the Queen of Belgium. But my personal favorite part of the whole week has been watching news agencies trying to do everything in their power to avoid putting the phrase Mount Queen Elizabeth on all of their headlines. Going from there, though, there were some other interesting news stories that broke this week. One of the ones that's, again, particularly relevant to Alberta has to do with the border blockade at Coutts. So there's some newly released records that have revealed that some of the men who have been charged, so there's a boatload of men, 4, give or take, who have been charged with effectively plotting to have a bit of an armed insurrection at the Coutts blockade. They're part of a group called Diagolon. We've talked about them in the past, and they're trying to push for a white supremacist Canada. Basically, they want to cut the country in half and have the western half all to the white folks, I guess. And they were prepared to get incredibly violent over the situation that was unfolding at the Coutts blockade, so much so that they were looking at bringing in weapons. I know this doesn't sound very light so far, but I promise we're getting to the good part. The really fun part is these guys figured that no one would possibly take women seriously. So if they wanted to get a bunch of weapons brought in, then they should use women to bring in those weapons. They had a whole plan with a hockey duffel bag, and they were going to have, they'd identified 2 women that they were going to have pick up this hockey duffel bag full of weapons so that they could have their little armed insurrection at the Coutts border. But what they didn't realize, and I love this so much, is that those 2 women that nobody would ever suspect, nobody suspected that they were undercover police officers. So those 2 women were undercover RCMP officers, and they conveyed and communicated everything, and that actually allowed the RCMP to do some more in-depth investigation than they would normally be able to do, because there was a risk of imminent harm involved in that. But there is something absolutely wonderful about a bunch of guys thinking, well, no one would ever take women seriously, and falling victim to that themselves. Moving on from there. There's been a lot of conversation this week about the teachers list. This has been a sort of a pet project of Adriana LaGrange, where she's been talking about the fact that she's going to put forward this teachers list where you're going to be able to see all of the teachers that teach in Alberta. You're going to be able to see their registration history, and if they've been up to no good or anything like that, was the theory. The problem is, that's not what it's been at all. First of all, it's been extremely harmful because there have been a lot of teachers who have had various names that have been used. Some of these teachers are trying to get away from domestic violence situations, and there has been a lot of teachers who have actually been dead named. For those of you that aren't familiar, dead naming is the process when somebody is trans and they transition. They leave their old gender's name behind often, not always, but often, and they have a new name. And it's considered to be quite disrespectful and quite rude, and ignores the transition, which is a pretty major event that this person has gone through, to use their old name. Now, it's something that some people struggle with, but it's something that everybody, I think, should work towards. Well, these teachers lists are effectively outing a lot of trans teachers by referring to them not only as their current teacher name, but their dead name as well. And that's really not appropriate. It's really not okay. But the irony of the whole situation is that because of publication bans that have been affiliated with some court cases, particularly court cases that involve youth, which tend to be the ones that most people are worried about anyways, there's a lot of concern that teachers who actually represent threats, that information isn't appearing on the teachers list anyway. CBC did a really good job of unearthing at least one example where there was a teacher who had assaulted, molested a 15-year-old boy. And she's serving jail time right now, and there's no record of that appearing in this teacher's registry, because there's a publication ban. So it seems to be yet another example of an attempt by the UCP to placate the fears that they've whipped up, which, as you'll notice tonight, is going to be a bit of a theme, and not being able to do so. Not being able to execute on that because they didn't think it through, because they were too busy whipping up everybody's fears. Moving on from there, the UCP have announced that they have started their policy rating process. So for those of you that aren't familiar, here's how most political parties go about getting their policies. What they do is they source out what are all the policies that we should have as a party? What should we stand for? And they reach out to all their constituency associations and they say, hey, you guys, you should write us some policies. We'll take a look at them. The best ones, we're going to bring them forward, and then the membership will vote on them at our annual general meeting, or AGM. And typically what happens is most of those policies for a lot of parties get vetted. Speaking from my own personal experience, when I was involved with the Alberta Party, there were policies that went forward that were sometimes just shut down right away because they were of such poor quality. But all of the ones that the policy committee believed would have a chance of being impactful or having the membership get engaged with, those ones were brought forward. Now, the next step of the process tends to be, well, policy conventions are pretty busy. So how are we going to figure out which ones we get to first, which ones we get to last? How does that all work? And typically what happens is a ranked voting process. So all of the policies that are available get kicked out to the membership, and the membership then goes, oh, I really, really like that one. That's the one that I want to see go up right away. Well, they've started that process. And with that process, they have released a bunch of their policies. And they're exactly as bad as you might think. We're going to talk about a few of those right now. So working through the list, these are the ones that we got sent that are particularly, let's go with, striking. So one of the policies wants to halt the practice of any student being taught that by reason of their ethnic heritage they are privileged, they are inherently racist, or they bear historic guilt due to said ethnic heritage, or that all of society is a racist system. Further, any differential treatment produced by any educator due to said ethnic heritage will be halted. Instruction of these concepts will not take place whether it is advanced under the title of the so-called critical race theory, intersectionality, anti-racism, diversity or inclusion, or some other name. Now, I got to be honest. When I first read that policy proposal, my first thing was, you've got to be super privileged to come up with something like that, because it's really, really terrible. There is a reality that there are people in society who have more advantages or more privilege than other people just by nature of their culture, just by nature of their ethnic heritage. And we've talked about this many times on the show. We talked about this last week, where we were talking about the fact that there are female contributors to The Breakdown who get some really, really offensive hate mail by nature of the fact that they're women. I don't get that same stuff, and I tend to say much more provocative things than they do. So the reality is, privilege is a real thing. And if you think that you can ignore it, if you think that you can say, I don't have more privilege than other people, if you're just going to ignore that entirely, guess what? You're pretty privileged to begin with. They also want to implement a school voucher system so that all funding will go to each student will get a set amount of money, and that will follow them wherever they want to go. If they want to go to a public school, cool. If they want to go to a private school, also cool. Now, the danger of this is that it makes it much easier, to divert funding away from the public school system and put it towards private schools. We've certainly seen a lot of conversation over the last couple of weeks and months with the UCP leadership race, where people are talking about the fact that UCP leadership candidates are talking about the fact that they want to have more choice in education. They want to have micro schools. They want teachers to be able to set up schools in their living room and provide all of the programs. It's ridiculous, but it's also unquestionably going to undermine not only the public system, but there's a very real risk that it'll undermine kids' education. Because if kids start going to these micro schools that don't have school boards, that don't have administrators overlooking them, if it's just, here's a set amount of money that follows your kid around, we could be getting ourselves into real problems in regards to the quality of education those kids are going to get. Because believe it or not every teacher has a gymnasium in their backyard. They want to eliminate inconsistent regulatory regimes, inefficient regulations, and unnecessary red tape, which allows the cities of Calgary and Edmonton legislative authority to modify and even override legislation passed by the government of Alberta. Now, this is a particularly rich one, and I say this because one of the biggest topics of the whole UCP leadership race, and we're going to be getting into this in just a bit, has to do with the Alberta Sovereignty Act, where the province of Alberta would effectively say, we don't like what you're saying to us, federal government, and we don't like these rules that you're making. They might be unconstitutional. We don't know. So we're going to say no. We're not going to do any of those things. But here we have the UCP putting forward a policy where they're saying, whoa, but we don't want the cities doing that to us. I mean, I don't know what the textbook definition of hypocrisy looks like, but I bet it's a lot like that. They want to restrict solar and wind energy or municipal development on highly productive irrigated lands, keeping solar panels and wind farms to lower grade dry land areas. Which is another really fascinating point, because if you know anything about the history of Southern Alberta, most of Southern Alberta was lower grade dry land areas. There were huge irrigation projects that were initiated in order to turn that land into something that could be used for agriculture. But prior to that, it simply wasn't usable for agriculture. This is one that really gets me going, I'll say. They want to allow Alberta corporations to donate to political parties in the province the same levels as private individuals. So the UCP just went out of their way to remove corporate donations, and now they want to put them back. It's almost as if the UCP hasn't been the number one fundraiser in the province of Alberta for the last little while. They want to implement a right to try law for promising therapies not yet approved in desperate medical situations. Now, this is one that gets a little bit controversial because there are a lot of people who do want to access, who are dealing with incredibly chronic conditions that have huge impacts on their quality of life, and they want to be able to access treatments that haven't yet been used by Health Canada. And in extremely dire situations, it's very, very easy to understand why they would want to do that. The problem is, this same thing could very easily be used to justify the kind of reckless, dangerous treatments that some people were wanting to pursue, and apparently even some physicians were willing to consider during COVID, like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, both which have been proven to have zero positive effect when it comes to COVID. But if somebody has a right to try, they could potentially, theoretically, demand access to these medications, and it could have serious, serious outcomes. The next one's a little bit tricky. It's tricky because it doesn't really happen all that much, but it's also tricky because it's very clearly a dog whistle. They want to stop funding late-term third trimester abortions except for when the physical health of the mother is in jeopardy or when there is sexual assault or incest. Now, when we put this policy up, we were inundated by nurses and obstetricians who very quickly said that doesn't happen. In the third trimester, it's called a birth. Now, whether or not that fetus is born live, that's a whole different conversation. But the reality is, third-term abortions don't happen hardly ever. Another important thing to take a look at with this policy is that it doesn't include the health of the mother in it. Well, it does, sorry. It includes the physical health of the mother is in jeopardy. But it doesn't include the reality that it simply doesn't happen. The other concern with that policy, just to go back to it for a sec, sorry, is that this is how many states in the United States started the conversation about restricting women's access to abortions and healthcare. This is how that began. We're going to start with something that never, ever, ever happens. The whole term, late-term abortions, was invented in the U.S. as a dog whistle to start to get the ball rolling. And the fact that that same policy is looking at being implemented here only underscores the fact that it's a very, very dangerous and slippery slope. And that's not hyperbolic to say, because if you take a look at what's happening in the States right now, it's a very real risk. They want to uphold the rights of parents and caregivers so as not to require them to affirm or socially condition a child in a gender identity that is incongruent with the child's birth sex. I'm not aware of any laws on the books currently that say, hey, if your kid wants to use different pronouns, if your kid wants to be identified as a different gender, you're legally required to use those things. And in fact, we've had plenty of conversations on the show with people who are trans who have said, one of the things that hurt me the most when I was a kid was my parents' or my family's refusal to acknowledge who I am. But there's no laws that say anywhere that a parent has to use the pronouns that their kid wants. So this is another one of those policies that you really have to ask, what's the problem that's being solved here? Because if there's no problem that's being solved, then the next question has to be, what's the agenda that's being advanced here? They want to work with the provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba to secure a transportation utility corridor to the Port of Churchill to enable expansion of our commodity exports into Europe. This is a pipe dream that just refuses to die, pun intended, by the way. Engineers have been looking at the Port of Churchill for a really long time, and there's two fundamental problems with it. One of them is it freezes a lot. The other one is it's not that deep. You can't get big ships into that port. But the third and bigger problem is it's surrounded by muskeg. It's basically mud. Really, really thick, really, really dirty mud that doesn't support any kind of construction. So anybody who's promising, we could just go to the Port of Churchill. They're looking at a map and they're going, well, that'd be a great line. But they're not taking into any kind of consideration the actual reality of the terrain that's involved or the conditions that are involved. The freedom of conscience one has come back yet again, and they're doubling down on it. So they want to update their previous policy. The previous policy said the United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should protect the rights of healthcare workers to freedom of conscience. They want to make it really clear. We're not just talking about protecting rights. We're talking about telling people no. They want to update it to say to protect the rights of medical professionals to refuse or to perform or assist in the provision of procedures contrary to their conscience or religious beliefs. Right now, if a healthcare worker doesn't feel comfortable providing a service or providing a treatment, they have an obligation to provide a referral to a healthcare provider who will do that. This would remove that. And where this gets really problematic and really complicated is when we're talking about rural Alberta. If you live in Calgary, I mean, people are having a hard time finding GPs as it is, but if you live in Calgary, odds are there's a couple of walk-in clinics in your immediate area that you can probably go visit, and you'll probably be able to find at the very least somebody who's going to give you a referral. But if you live in Fairview, Alberta, there's only a couple of docs up there. I mean, that's one of the locations that's had to close their ER on multiple occasions because they have a physician shortage. So if you run into a physician in one of these smaller locations who says, you know what, I'm not okay with that. I don't believe that you getting an abortion, it goes against my religious beliefs. I don't believe that me providing any sort of counseling in regards to any sort of trans issues, that goes against my religious beliefs. So I'm just going to shut you out. You don't get to access those things unless you own a car or there's somebody else that you know that does, that you trust, who can get you to the next town over to see maybe you can talk to a physician there who might not pull the same card. It's a really, really big deal. And it's fundamentally dangerous because at the end of the day, when we start to talk about emergent situations, imagine, if you will, there's a physician working in an emergency room and somebody comes in with a gunshot. And when that physician does their examination of that person, they see a giant swastika tattooed across their chest. Well, that person's a Nazi. Should that physician still treat them? Ask any healthcare worker who has any kind of professional ethics or conscience, and they'll absolutely tell you yes. But apparently, if you ask the UCP, they'll say, well, maybe that physician should be allowed to let that person die. The best one, the most entertaining one, of course, because it doesn't exist yet. They want to immediately resolve to pass the Alberta Sovereignty Act, authorizing the provincial government to refuse enforcement of any federal law or policy attacking Alberta's charter freedoms or provincial rights. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit more because Danielle Smith had some words on the Sovereignty Act this week as well. But it's fascinating that the UCP is bringing forward a policy to say, hey, this legislation that doesn't exist, that experts, constitutional experts, lawyers have all said, this thing won't work. The UCP want to pass that as a policy right away, which is a fascinating, absolutely fascinating piece. But here's the real kicker to the whole thing. Like I said at the beginning of this whole rant in regards to the UCP policies, one of the things that's really important to realize is that this will happen at their AGM. The decisions as to how these policies either get voted yay or nay for will happen at their AGM, their annual general meeting, which of course you have to buy tickets for. And they're not cheap. If you're a youth member, $149. If you're an early bird member, $299. Goes up by $76 more. It'll be $375 for you to attend the AGM if you're a UCP member to vote on these policies. If you want to go to the dinner reception, it's only $100. And here's the best part. Some of you might remember about a year ago at the last UCP AGM, there were a wonderful group of people who decided to crowdfund an observer pass for the breakdown, which they revoked, which wasn't very cool. But that crowdfunding was $500. Well, they've doubled that cost now. It's now $999 for non-members wishing to observe the AGM proceedings. Not only are these policies fundamentally destructive to Alberta, not only are a lot of them illegal Not only are they, a lot of them, counter to the morals and ethics that so many Albertans conduct themselves with, but if you want to vote on them, even if it's just to stop them as a UCP member, you got to fork out at least $300. And that's if you go for the early bird ticket. It's pretty stunning. Moving on from there, Mr. Kenney was joined by his Minister of Health. Oh, that's the wrong picture, sorry. He was joined by his Minister of Health to make an announcement in regards to surgical capacity in central and southern Alberta. And basically what they announced, it was nothing more than they're issuing 2 RFPs, or request for proposals, to the ether to say, hey, have you ever wanted to open up a knee surgery clinic or a general surgery clinic in southern or central Alberta? Send us your proposal. It's kind of like how they shopped out the proposals for the urban police force. But they're not paying anybody that we know of to put forward these proposals. But that was their big announcement. But that press conference that Mr. Copping and Mr. Kenney attended got a little bit derailed because, as you can imagine, there were a lot of reporters who had very specific questions about the Alberta Sovereignty Act. Now, the next bit of audio, I'm confident that's going to work. I spent all afternoon testing this, so fingers crossed. The next bit of audio it's a little bit longer, but it's really important to listen to because not only is it the first time in my life that I found myself in a position where I've said, wow, Jason Kenney's right about this. But it really summarizes the fundamental flaws with the Alberta Sovereignty Act. Let's take a listen.
Well, it's completely with precedent for a premier to articulate and defend government policy. The government I lead was elected on a platform to build a strong Alberta in a united Canada, to create jobs, the economy, and get pipelines built. And to respect the rule of law. The so-called Sovereignty Act would effectively take us to the brink of separation from the Canadian Federation, would shred the rule of law, and would do devastating damage to jobs, the economy, and the prospect of pipelines. This is a cockamamie idea that was first floated by a far-right special interest group a year ago. I'm not engaging in the leadership election. I'm not endorsing or opposing a particular candidate. I am maintaining the consistent position of the democratically elected government, which is to defend a strong Alberta in a united Canada, the rule of law, and to defend Alberta's economy. And I have always been consistent in my belief that the rule of law is a fundamental conservative principle. The so-called Alberta Sovereignty Act is a full frontal attack on the rule of law. I have always been unapologetically a Canadian patriot. I'm not about to become spineless on my patriotism or my support for the rule of law because somebody in a leadership campaign disagrees. This is a law, and I'm going to quote from the proposal that was made a year ago, on which I have been commenting for a year. The Alberta Sovereignty Act would provide Alberta's legislature with the authority to refuse enforcement of any specific federal court ruling that Alberta's elected body deemed to be federal intrusion. So this is an idea to shred the rule of law, the authority of the courts. I just came back from Korea, talking to some of the largest companies in Asia about multi-billion-dollar investments in Alberta. I can tell you that those investors, the Alberta Sovereignty Act would be like kryptonite for them. They're interested in political stability, not political chaos. They're interested in a jurisdiction that respects the rule of law and the authority of the courts, not one that thumbs its nose, Banana Republic style, at those foundational principles. And so I make no apologies for speaking out against a cockamamie idea that is, according to its own authors, a step towards separation. If you think we've had economic challenges in the past, wait till you see a landlocked Alberta that has no use of the federal power to get interprovincial infrastructure like pipelines built. Wait till BC gets the idea that they can play the same game to block our pipelines. If Alberta, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If Alberta can ignore federal court rulings and federal jurisdiction, clearly articulated in the Constitution, then so can British Columbia. British Columbia right now is complying with federal jurisdiction and a federal court order striking down their efforts to block the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which is existential for Alberta jobs and our economic future. If Alberta validates, if Alberta comes out with an act like this and says, hey, any province can at whim ignore the Supreme Court of Canada, the Constitution, well, guess what? BC can say, we ignore federal authority over interprovincial pipelines and infrastructure. We ignore the ruling of the Supreme Court of Canada. We're going to stand in the way, not only of the Trans Mountain expansion, but perhaps the Coastal GasLink LNG Canada project.
Now, let's be really clear about a few things here. As much as Mr. Kenney is right about everything he said there, if you watch the video, if you're watching our live stream, and even if you're just listening to it, you can hear it in his voice. Mr. Kenney is recognizing the fact that he's been fanning these flames that Danielle Smith and others are actively dumping gasoline onto. Mr. Kenney embraced a lot of the rhetoric that is just a hair shy of what we've been seeing. And what you saw and heard right there was, as we said earlier in the week, the reaction of a 5-year-old kid who's been playing with matches, who looks up and suddenly, with horror, realizes that he's lit the drapes on fire. As much as Mr. Kenney might want to disabuse himself from the responsibility that he carries for getting this rhetoric to where it is, to where people like Danielle Smith could pick it up, he bears a lot of responsibility for it. He has exercised all the way through the pandemic in hyperbole. He has spoken in extremely confrontational tones about the federal government. So while it is a rare state of affairs to be able to say, Kenney got it right on that point, on what he said in that clip, it's very, very hard for anybody who's been paying attention to the situation to disagree with him. It's only unfortunate that it took him so long to put the pieces together, how dangerous it was, the things that he was playing with. But Mr. Kenney wasn't the only person who went after the Sovereignty Act this week. 4 UCP leadership contestants stood together and said, this thing is very, very bad. Rajan Sawhney, Leela Aheer, Travis Taves, and Brian Jean all held a press conference where they took turns saying this thing is a train wreck. It is going to cause irreparable damage to the fabric of our province, not only from an economic standpoint, but from the standpoint of the damage that it's going to do to the body politic. They hedged it in saying, we really, really hope Miss Smith listens to our concerns. We really, really hope that she recognizes that maybe all the lawyers and the constitutional scholars and the greater half of the leadership race saying this is bad, we should not do it. We hope that she'll listen to us. But that's not really what Danielle Smith did. This is our very best angry, scary picture of Danielle Smith that we could find. We've used it a couple of times now, and it works really quite well. Danielle Smith had a response. She had a couple of things she wanted to say this week. And she talked about how she would use the Alberta Sovereignty Act. She talked about she would use the Alberta Sovereignty Act to prevent federal mandatory vaccination policies, even though that's not the realm of the federal government. Healthcare is administered by provinces. If you take a look at all of the health measures that were brought in during the course of the pandemic, with the exception of international travel and federal employees, they were all the purview of individual employers and mandates that were put forward by the province. That's just the reality of it. So how the Sovereignty Act would be used against the province's own decisions by the premier who would be making those decisions begs a lot of questions. She talks about using the Emergencies Act to jail and freeze accounts of peaceful protesters. We're going to get to that one in a sec, because that's another piece of revisionist history that is quite frankly just toxic. She was authorizing immediate commencement of private and public projects being held up by federal agencies under the authority of Bill C-69. She would just override that using the Alberta Sovereignty Act. She would just ignore those laws and wait for the Supreme Court to issue a ruling, which could take years. So what she's proposing there is that she would fully commit to a project, spend boatloads of money on that project, and then if it's canceled, oh well. That doesn't sound familiar at all, does it? Mandatory cuts to fertilizers use by Alberta's farmers. Well, it's not mandatory, it's optional. Mandatory emissions and production cuts to Alberta energy companies. That's actually been something that's been ruled by the Supreme Court to be in the federal government's jurisdiction. Mandatory cuts to electricity generation and the use of fossil fuels is recently announced by Canada's Environment Minister. And again, she says that it's likely a violation of the Charter and 92A of the Constitution, but unfortunately, it's already been ruled on by the Supreme Court to be federal jurisdiction. Provincial takeover of firearms licensing, and refusing to enforce federal firearms ownership regulations. It's almost as if she has never, ever looked at or consulted with anybody who follows the Supreme Court, because guess what? Yet again, firearms ownership, purview of the federal government, ruled by the Supreme Court. Federal censorship or inappropriate action of Albertans or independent media based in Alberta. File that one under the same category. But where it gets really, really fun with the whole Danielle Smith talking about the seizure, the Emergency Act seizure of the convoy money. Let's take a little trip down memory lane, shall we? What was the first freezing of convoy funds? Who initiated that? Oh, right, it was the banks. Well before the Emergency Act was initiated, TD Bank froze accounts that received money for the Canadian protests, because even those banks recognized there's something really, really wrong going on here. There's probably some laws that are being broken. There's probably some fraudulent stuff, and we don't want to be affiliated with that. So while it's true that the RCMP did eventually give a list of, hey, here's the accounts that we need frozen to banks, those were only initiated to people who were actively participating in the protest and who had been identified as likely breaking laws. That's it. But again, most of the freezes that were started initially didn't come from the feds. They didn't come from the RCMP. They came from the banks who didn't want to get burned by having their institutions involved in something like that. Danielle Smith lies a lot. She misrepresents things a lot. She likes to mislead people. She likes to phrase things in such a way that people who are angry, people who are upset, will come to their own conclusions about things. And she did that this week as well. Because later, or on the 6th of September, she came out, big headline from the Danielle Smith Twitter and Facebook accounts. Breaking! Wasn't breaking, it was like a week and a half old. In a press conference, Justin Trudeau warns Canadians if they're not caught up on boosters at a 90% rate, that more rules and restrictions are to be expected. I will use the Alberta Sovereignty Act to say no. Well, let's take a listen to what the Prime Minister actually said.
COVID's not done with us yet. We might want to be done with it, but it's still around. And yes, we have a lot more tools, a lot more understanding, a lot more knowledge on how to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe that have allowed us to get back to regular life in a lot of ways for a whole bunch of people. But we also know that as winter comes and as people get pushed back indoors, there is a real risk of another serious wave of COVID. One of the best things we can do to prevent that wave, prevent the pressure on our healthcare systems, prevent provinces from having to take decisions around restrictions and mandates, is to ensure that everyone is up to date in their vaccinations. The recommendation is, you should be up to date in your vaccinations if you have had a dose within 6 months. Everyone who has been a while since their vaccination should look at the fact that we have new vaccines coming out this month that are tailored against Omicron, that will provide better protection, and everyone should get out and get vaccinated. If we are able to hit that 80, 85, 90% of Canadians up to date in their vaccinations, we'll have a much better winter with much less need for the kinds of restrictions and rules that were so problematic for everyone over the past years.
So there, the Prime Minister acknowledged that the restrictions were problematic. He acknowledged that they were inconvenient. He acknowledged, but nowhere in there did he say, and if we don't hit that 85, 90%, I'm personally coming for you with rules from the federal government. What he alluded to, and what any sincere or intelligent person would take from that, is that if we can get the vaccination rates to where they need to be to provide the appropriate amount of protection for everybody, then provinces who initiated the first set of restrictions in the first place won't have to look at doing that again. It's that simple. But that's not how Danielle Smith presented it. Danielle Smith apparently got this story from a couple of different potentially right-wing news sources. The video clip that you saw there, we got from True North. And they presented it as, Prime Minister Trudeau. They even cut the video off. He's going to be implementing more mandates. And it's disingenuous to do that. Because again, the only mandates that the federal government put into place were around international travel and around federal employees. Everything else came from the provinces. You would think somebody who's running for the highest office in the province of Alberta would at least acknowledge that basic fact, but that would be profoundly off-brand for Danielle Smith. Little kicker to the whole story, though, has to do with the fact that Danielle Smith likes to talk about how, it's our First Nations. First of all, they're not ours. They're First Nations. They're their own nations. We need to stop referring to First Nations peoples as ours. It's a possessive. It's not appropriate. But it's the favorite way Danielle Smith likes to describe them. So Danielle Smith likes to talk about how First Nations people are super, super excited about that corridor to the Port of Churchill that will sink into the Muskeg on the first thaw. They want to be part of that rich investment game. They're all over that. And it's not true. There's a Northern Alberta First Nation that has currently begun suing the province of Alberta, claiming that the cumulative effects from industry, agriculture, and settlement are so pervasive they violate the band's treaty rights. They're not alone. We've seen lawsuits like this in British Columbia that were successful, I might add. And we have seen other bands in Northern Alberta say, you know what, we're going to pursue this. And they only stopped when the provincial government guaranteed that chunks of land that were sacred to them and part of their treaty rights would be left alone. There would be no development. Nothing would go on there. The representation that First Nations are some kind of monolith that are all on the same page is disingenuous, and it doesn't do anything to advance the purposes of reconciliation. But now we're getting to the juicy stuff. So there's been a lot of conversation around AISH lately. We just recently did a whole episode where we sat down with an amazing AISH recipient who basically walked through all of the problems with the program, walked through all of his concerns with how people view the program, and especially walked through the fact that the program is wildly underfunded. One of the reasons that the program is wildly underfunded is because back in November of 2019, when the UCP government first got into power, one of the very early things that they did was to de-index AISH. Now, what that means is AISH was for a very long time set at amounts. And one of the last things that the NDP government did, and I will say they took their sweet time getting to it, was to index AISH to inflation. So as inflation goes up, as the cost of living goes up, That meant that on a yearly basis, it would be reevaluated and AISH recipients would get bumps to ensure that they were keeping up with inflation. Well, the UCP said, we're not going to do that. One of the other things they did was they changed the payment schedule. And that was something that the Auditor General called them out on because it was purely a move on books to make it look like they were saving money when they weren't. But it caused a lot of havoc for AISH recipients because they were now running into situations where they weren't able to pay their rent on time, they weren't able to pay their bills on time. Now, most AISH recipients have adjusted, from what we've heard anecdotally, most have adjusted to the new schedule. But the reality is, we're seeing nothing but news stories about the cost of living going up in Alberta and Canada and around the world. And AISH recipients no longer have the benefit of knowing that their amounts are going to be indexed every year. Now, a lot of those changes were put at the doorstep of Minister of, at the time, Community Services, Rajan Sawhney, who's also one of the leadership race candidates. Well, there have been rumors going on for quite some time that Minister Sawhney at the time, she wasn't exactly really happy about this, but they were nothing more than rumors. Well, they're not rumors anymore because we have been able to confirm through a source extremely high up in the provincial government that Rajan Sawhney had nothing to do with those changes. In fact, what this person who we've been able to, this isn't an anonymous from the DM's Twitter thing. This is directly from a person that we've been able to identify and confirm is in a position that they would definitively know whether or not this was how things happened. This person has been able to confirm, under the condition of anonymity, which is valid for a lot of reasons, that the decision for de-indexing all government programs came from Treasury, Board, and Finance. So we're not just talking about AISH. We're talking about seniors' benefits. We're talking about the fact that tax brackets were de-indexed. All of those decisions came from Treasury, Board, and Finance. And at the time, Rajan Sawhney found out after the fact. Now, obviously, this is not something that she could ever go public with because she's got to deal with cabinet confidence, and Lord knows if we've spent our last year on anything, we have heard a lot about cabinet confidence and how ministers and caucus members are held under an extremely tight hand. So obviously, this is something that she wouldn't at that time or now or probably ever really be able to say, yeah, this is what happened. But this anonymous source confirms for us that she had no say in it, found out about it after the decision was made, and she tried to argue against it. In fact, what this source tells us is that there were discussions to make reductions in the program and to change eligibility in the program. And what we're told is that Minister Sawhney at the time went to the Premier's office and said, if you do that, I'm gone. She threatened to quit. She said she would not be a part of making any reductions or changes in eligibility. And apparently, Premier Kenney recognized that he didn't want to lose Rajan Sawhney as a minister, and he intervened. Now, this has been, like I said, something that's been speculated on for quite some time, but we can say definitively, based on who that source is, it's absolutely true. And it really underscores the fact. I mean, we've been talking about the way that government makes decisions for most of the year. And one of the things that we keep coming back to is that as much as governments may be elected through democracy, and while voters may assume that governments are run using the same principles, they're not in any party. We've seen it from the NDP, where we had an ex-justice minister, an ex-NDP justice minister came out and said, yeah, caucus doesn't get a say in anything. People get their marching orders, and that's what they do. And we've heard the same thing from the UCP. And this is part of a much bigger conversation that we're going to try to keep going through the rest of the year. But speaking of bigger conversations, we are extremely excited to be joined by Deirdre Mitchell-McLean, who is going to hopefully, if she's still there and we're not having the technical issues that we had last time around, fingers crossed, she's going to talk to us a little bit about. Hey, Deirdre, has anything gone on in federal politics in the last little while?
I'm just relocating. That's why I was a little bit slow on that. I'm just getting away from Hillview, so just 2 seconds here. Let me get up the road. Okay. So yes, there was something very exciting. I mean, ish, if you hadn't been paying attention and didn't realize what was going to happen. But Pierre Poilievre is the new leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. And was that a noise from my end or yours?
I don't think it was. I'm not sure, but let's keep going.
Okay. As long as I'm not being lost here. So, I mean, the amazing thing about last night, it was last night, it was Saturday. The amazing thing was that when his wife, Anaida Poilievre, introduced him, and holy crap, this woman is going to be a massive asset to Pierre Poilievre. It was shockingly good. Her introduction, her speech, her cadence, her everything was just pitch perfect. And Poilievre, when he got up, he did not thank the convoy supporters for coming out and voting. He did not reiterate anything about the World Economic Forum or going after the governor of the Bank of Canada. He sounded pretty statesmanlike. And I'll tell you, I looked at that, it was maybe 15 minutes long, between the two of them. And I was like, anyone who thought that electing Poilievre was going to make it an easy run for the Liberals may find that is not correct. If that's the Poilievre that we're going to see as the leader of the opposition.
Do you think that's here's the thing that I was struck by. I'll be honest, I didn't watch it. A, because I knew that you were, and B, because I was otherwise indisposed. But I knew that the Twitter was going to be aflutter with all of the developments and the Poilievre-ness of it all. But we just saw, one of the things that we talked about earlier in the episode was Mr. Kenney, who has kind of done this oh shit, the drapes are on fire approach to how he's fanned the flames of things. And Mr. Poilievre's campaign appeared to be nothing more than, I've got a flamethrower, what's flammable?
Yeah.
Do you think he's going to have a harder time? Because one of the things that's different, I think, a little bit is the air quotes convoy supporters. And again, I don't want to represent any group as a monolith. But boy, they're vocal.
Mm-hmm.
And if Poilievre starts to get off of their message when they're the ones, I mean, you take a look at the spread of the voting, it's pretty clear. I mean, I saw somebody make a very apt observation that when you take a look at the things, it's very, very clear that there's some overlap between the donations to the convoy and where Poilievre got the bulk of his votes.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's a risk of this, maybe the fire catches up to him a little bit?
Well, I mean, it really depends. So the convoy, yes, there are some elements of the ridiculous about some of the things that they were doing and saying. But what it boiled down to, and I heard this, so I listened to, do Do you remember when they were doing that CB radio chat
I
thing?
did. I know what you're talking about.
Okay, so I actually did tune in because I have to know. Um, so I tuned into that for a few days, and even though, I mean, severely misguided in what they were trying to do, like and how they were going about doing it, because of course breaking the laws just doesn't tend to work out too well if that's how you're going to go about getting your message. But the thing is that, on the deep down, there were people who really felt like this was going to that vaccine mandates and things were really hurting people and really going to hurt people. Like there was a real fear and a real concern about how this was going to affect people. Maybe some of them, like directly, I couldn't honestly say, but so underneath, like I said, underneath a lot of the ridiculousness, there was a real fear. And if Polyev was actually able to appropriately address that he understood that, then honestly, he doesn't have to pivot so much. I mean, obviously the WEF stuff, I mean, he's not going to be able to keep that sort of thing up, right? The conspiracy theories, because it will turn people off. There's just no way about it, or no two ways about it. But he could keep those groups happy by just sticking to what is more of the libertarian credo, and that's, protecting your freedoms. So he might not have to really pivot so long as he maintains that messaging. And like, yeah, it did seem like he was, like you said, throwing a blowtorch around and just trying to light anything on fire. But again, it depends on whether or not people that supported him or were supporting him felt like they were heard. And again, even the aptitude for, really, really bad things. I think that the majority of people, even in the convoy supporters, they're not there. Yes, there's a few, but the majority of them aren't, going to do something outrageous. So I think he can do it if he keeps his messaging tight. I think he can do it. And I don't know, honestly. I did mention this in the newsletter today. That I was like, I don't know if he can keep this up for 3 more years.
Well, that was my next question, because like we just had a federal election and Mr. Trudeau has said that he's sticking around for the next run. So I don't see Trudeau immediately saying, oh, we're out of the pandemic by and large now, at least publicly, perception-wise. Numbers-wise, we definitely aren't. But we're out of the public perception is we're out of the pandemic. I'd like to run against Pierre Poilievre when he's at the apex of his strength. I think what we're going to see is Mr. Trudeau go, I want to see Pierre Poilievre try to placate all of these people for the next 3 years. I want to see what happens with their donations. I want to see, because, I mean, one of the things that we've seen from the Conservatives is that they lean very heavily into this fear-based rhetoric in order to get the monies. And so they're either going to have to continue with the WEF stuff in order to get the monies, or they're going to not be able to keep those members. They're not going to be able to keep those donations up. And Trudeau gets a run of ground game for 3 years.
But, like, think about how political party comms actually comes out, right? It's got different MP, MLA names attached to them. Poilievre never has to put his name to it. Like, they could sit around the table and say, okay, who is going to be the voice for this particular group? And so every fundraising email that comes out can come from that one person.
But do you think the guy who had the rallies is going to be able to to be like, I don't want to be the center of attention anymore. I'm gonna let that guy do it.
Yeah, well, and that's like I said, it's going to be a tight rope to walk, um, staying within that line. And like I said, I mean, I've seen Polyev here and there over the last however many years he's been an elected official. Um, he is he's brash, he's abrasive, and I mean, that's the role that he's played. Now, there was an article written, oh, Paul Wells wrote it, I think, in maybe when he was going to run for the leadership. And like, Paul was like, I've seen him, I know the type of person that he can be. That's not the person that he's showing us. And, but that, I mean, just looking back on that particular article, the way that he was describing what like the potential that he has to be more statesman-like, maybe that has, I mean, if he can do it, that's going to help him.
I honestly
And
wonder though, because like the other challenge that I see is one of the things that we've heard so much from the freedom folks is that their frustrations are with the establishment. Their frustrations are with the crooked politicians. And I think one of the things that we've seen, and certainly that I've seen from the comments on the social medias, has been, no, Pierre, he's the real thing. He's sincere. He means it. Danielle Smith, she's sincere. She means it. Donald Trump, he's sincere. He means it. And there's almost an inevitable dissonance that's going to show up when, if Polyev, I mean, Trump, to his historical, I don't want to say credit.
I caught that.
to his whatever word somebody smarter than me can think of, he was consistent. Like we never saw a statesman Donald Trump. We saw Donald Trump, and then he kept being Donald Trump, and now there's nuclear secrets. And one of the things that I wonder, I mean, we saw with O'Toole, he tried to do the heavy rhetoric during the campaign, and then he moved to the middle, which many strategists have opined is the smart and the safe thing to do. It didn't work out so great for O'Toole. I wonder if, with the conservative politicians that we're seeing in all of these races who are leaning so hard into the Donald Trump playbook of politics, their choices are going to be sustain it at, all of the risk to society and democracy, or don't, and then we'll see what happens. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, you're 100% correct, and it's just going to be a matter of whether or not that works out. I think it's, and so I'm not a Trudeau stan. Am I using that right?
I don't know.
So I don't know either. But then again, that's probably the Alberta girl sort of upbringing and environment that, you just don't support Trudeau's. But the thing is, I've seen this from a lot of people who don't necessarily support him to begin with, but saying that, he should let somebody else lead before this next election. And I mean 2 elections ago or 1 election ago. This is something that keeps coming up, but I notice it's coming from people who don't necessarily support him in the first place. So I always have to take that with a grain of salt, because, it has less meaning. No offense to us.
Yeah.
But it does. And so, there's Stephen Carter and them have talked about this before, and it's called voter fatigue. And people just get tired of a particular government. Obviously, we don't see that often in Alberta, but federally, they do change, right? And people just get, okay, I just don't want this this government anymore. We're going to switch over to this one now. So I think there's a real risk, and I think Trudeau's actually putting more risk by staying on, and that can make it so, because I've as I said before, watching the Conservatives, and they are adamant that if they just stick with conservative policies, conservative rhetoric, be more conservative consistently and unapologetically conservative, then they will get elected. And I mean, I know that a lot of people would disagree. I don't believe that conservative policies are necessarily bad policies.
I would argue, based on the policies that I read off earlier, a lot of them are.
Well, those are not necessarily conservative, so to speak, policies. Like, conservative policies are things that are more cautious. They don't tend to be super progressive, right? Like forward thinking, because they're just more cautious. Conservatives tend to be more cautious in general. They don't really go for a whole lot of change. Stick with what works kind of thing. So their policies can be tired, but they tend to generally be cautious policies, right? Kenney did not have, as Ken Bosenkohl put it, a conservative disposition, right? He was go, 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 keep people guessing. They can't keep up with everything that we're doing. And that was not a conservative disposition. Now, whether or not, I guess the biggest risk is that people become tired of Trudeau or the Liberal government. They want change, and they're going to go to the CPC because that's where they always go, except under Layton when they kind of moved to the NDP. But they tend to, go back and forth between the Conservatives and the Liberals. So what concerns me is that people might not be paying attention, and they're just like, yep, we're ready for change, we're going to vote for this, and the CPC could form government. There's never really been that much of a huge gap in the movement of votes. It doesn't take many people to decide to move over. So now it could backfire, right? Canadians just might not be ready for the Republican playbook.
Well, I almost feel like that there's a real risk of that, because I take a look, and I'm going to get up on my soapbox, but sweet Jesus, I hate True North. I'm just going to say it again. I hate them so much. And you talk about the fact that Poilievre took this very statesman approach, this almost like he was trying to be the prime minister, I guess. And all of the little True North hacks, they were busy talking about the fact that the Conservatives how dare they, do a land acknowledgement. I mean, I saw multiple of that little Jolly Pirate Nixon group expressing their contempt and displeasure that the Conservative Party of Canada of today would even consider entertaining the possibility of a land acknowledgement. And this got me really angry, I'll say, because, I mean, it's in the TRC, so go away. I'm really trying hard to limit my profanity because my mom still listens to this. I have other words that I very much like to use, but it's in the TRC. This is something that First Nations people have said is important. So I feel like, and maybe I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, when the victims of cultural genocide say, hey, could we get this little thing? If your white ass is so inconvenienced by 2 minutes, then you need to sit down and shut up and stop pretending to be a journalist, because you're not. You're a pundit at best, a hack of a pundit, but that's it. But secondary to that, for anybody to throw that kind of messaging out there after the last 2 weeks, like, if that's the tone that the base that got Poilievre is looking for, that dude, it's not even a tightrope he's got to walk. It's just a straight razor that goes on for 3 years.
Hmm. Well, and so someone mentioned to me today that that conservative members are not, like, one of the reasons why you're seeing, True North, that is, I believe you said it. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. I listened to too much stuff. Um, but what someone had said that Danielle Smith seems to have chosen True North
Yeah,
to be.
I did a whole
That
bit
was
about that.
okay. So when, so yeah, it's like uh, members. So conservatives are not listening to. They're not listening to mainstream media. They're not watching the news now. And conservative members, right? We've got some numbers on that. You might have 450,000 people across the country who are, they're tuning into True North. They're tuning into Rebel Media. And you may have 120,000 people in Alberta who are doing the same thing. But the mainstream Canadians, they're still listening to the news. They're still following mainstream media. And so the risk with giving those particular media organizations access, or sorry, like almost sole access to conservative membership, is that if they turn on you, you're going to have a problem, because these are individuals who, are willing to occupy a city.
Yeah.
And this could be, so I mean, it's actually not even that that Poilievre himself might mess it up, but by pushing people into very niche outlets to get their information, to get their news, like you've given those media outlets a lot of power. When
Yep.
they went after Kenny, who was there, who was listening, people who will buy conservative memberships. So it's a real risk what they have done with that. And I mean, again, are we going to pay for it? Probably not just yet.
I would argue that we already
Not
have.
yet.
I mean, the fact that Smith is giving almost sole access to an outlet like True North, and I wouldn't have beef with outlets like True North and the Rebel nearly as much if they said, "Hey, we're just talking." If they included in their bios, like certain responsible commentary satire outlets groups do, that they're absolutely not journalists, and they made that absolutely clear, then pontificate all you want, because Lord knows I can't judge anyone for that. But at least be honest about what you're doing. But when you're presenting it as journalism, when you're presenting it as unbiased,
yeah.
and it's so serving an agenda. Like, I try to imagine like a CBC or a CTV correspondent, or I don't care, whatever the journalistic organization that you believe in. Try to imagine them having a correspondent who's been assigned to cover a major event, and then from their own account tweeting out, "I can't believe that they're doing land acknowledgements. This is garbage." Like, in no universe would that happen where that person would remain employed for any length of time, because they're not practicing journalism, they're practicing hackery. And as an expert in hackery, I can recognize it.
Yeah, it's like I do agree. And I remember reaching out to a couple of lawyers who also blogged back in the day when I was doing it. And I said, is there anything that exists that could, force people to put disclaimers like this is opinion, something like that? Like I used to have like sometimes huge disclaimers on mine. Well, because of course I got snarky with them, right? Somebody said to me, "Well, didn't you used to be on the board of the Alberta Party? So are you really unbiased?" So like I started putting in you know, like I was Miss Blackballs 1991 or something. Um, but like I had tomato soup for lunch today. 'Cause I just got annoyed with it. But I get it to a point, but I had stepped down from that. I had gone away from it, so I was like, is this really necessary? But I kept it up for quite a while. But I also did it because, and I always put in that this post contains opinion because most of mine do. That's how I write. But I always link to, articles and stuff to back up whatever I'm saying. But the point is that there isn't anything out there that requires a journalistic or entertainment, infotainment outlet to declare that that's what they are. There are no
But I would argue,
restrictions.
and I don't want to spend too much time on this because I do want to talk about the UCP leadership race and how people should vote because we did promise people we would do that. But I would also argue that the failure to appropriately present your intentions and biases is a reflection of a person's integrity. If you take a look
Yeah.
at any academic paper or any medical paper, all of the ones that are taken seriously have the disclaimer that say, here's where the biases or any perceived bias could potentially exist. I think that if you've got any kind of, I don't know, predilection towards honesty, that being clear about what you're trying to do is probably super important. And if you don't do that, I think that that's just as telling. I mean, I look at the I'll use this last example, and then we'll talk about the UCP leadership race and the voting because the ballots did come out this week.
They did.
But Ezra Levant has testified in court that he's not a journalist, and what he provides is entertainment. And yet, to his audience,
Well, yeah.
he will absolutely talk about freedom of the press and journalistic, I don't know what. I don't really watch that much of the Rebel. I'll own that. But it's that, don't pretend to be something that you're not. And
Yeah.
if Ezra Levant wants to do infotainment, by all means, infotainment away, man. But when you've got Keean Bexte showing up, getting credentialed by Nathan Cooper to cover the legislation or the legislature, now you've got to pick a lane.
Yeah.
If you're going to claim to be like an actual journalist covering the actual things, you've got to behave like one. And if you don't, then people like me get to make fun of you.
That's fair.
So, UCP ballots came out. And we
Yes.
did have a couple of people last week ask what sort of advice, and I'm going to, in the interests of not being a raging hypocrite, the following segment is going to be full of opinion. But in the interest of maybe helping some people navigate a few things, are there any strategies that you would recommend, Deirdre?
Okay, yes. So one of the things that I did, and I will find that tweet for you, I ranked. So, I try to stay away when I'm trying to be helpful. Let's put it that way. I try to stay away from inflammatory language, right? So, I'm sure you've heard and seen a lot of people saying, "Well, which is the least worst of all the worst options?"
I've said that.
Yeah, many people have said that. And so what I did, again, trying to remove some of that inflammatory language, was I once ranked the leadership candidates on a scale of, and I called it Prentice to Kenny, right? So who's a little more PC, who's, more Kenny, and then, of course, Danielle Smith is out in outer space. But, she's in the race. And that's kind of how I put it together. And so I have this list, and I believe the way that I did it. So from Prentice, you have probably Leela here, Rajan Sani, Rebecca Schultz, Todd Lowen, Brian Jean, Todd Lowen, Travis Taves, and then outer space Danielle Smith. So
You put Taves less or more outer spacey than Lowen?
no, Taves is just more Kenny.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, Taves is closer to Kenny. Danielle Smith is in outer space.
That's
Just-
fair.
Yeah. Like, she had to be on the list, but she's really just out there. So the list, that's kind of how I put it together. And, whether or not people agree, and like I said, some movement within there as well. But basically, I think kind of that. You may think that Todd Loewen deserves to be right up with Danielle Smith. I actually didn't mind Todd Loewen when he was an independent MLA. After he got booted from the UCP caucus, I thought he did a half-decent job. I mean, same as Fildebrandt. Fildebrandt did a decent job as independent MLA, much more so than he did as part of the parties, I thought. So I didn't mind him too much. Yeah, he's, Todd Loewen is definitely more on the social conservative side. So, but I don't, like, between him and Taves, honestly, they could probably be switched around a little bit. Brian Jean is an enigma. I honestly do not know what that man's, true place is, because when I wrote about this, I called it UCP. It was the first UCP leadership race, and I called it the right light category, because Brian Jean did an interview with Rick Bell and came out like a centrist, and he walked that back like the next day. But there was a day where it was like, oh, is Brian Jean reasonable? I
Well, let's not forget. I just got to jump in with the. There was a fairly validated rumor, I'll say, that prior to Mr. Jean entering the UCP leadership race and the UCP leadership race being a thing, he was pursuing conversations with the centrist party in Alberta. So, I mean, I think Mr. Jean is kind of those, I can be what you want me to be.
Yeah, and and I mean, I think he comes across as genuine when he's talking about that. And even, he has said as well, he's like, I'm not the best public speaker. And he may not be, but he does come across quite often as being a genuine individual. Yet, and this, could very well be because someone else is consistently helping him with things like, his press releases, his articles that end up in the paper. And that particular individual has a much more right-leaning bend. So I honestly, though, I'm not sure. I am not sure who the real Brian Jean really is and where he fits. So that's all I can say about him. Leela here, Rajan Sani, possibly even Rebecca Schulz, even though I don't love that she just moved from Saskatchewan, but I have an issue with that.
I know you bump on it.
But she does seem like, a fairly reasonable individual, and I don't know, almost out of 10 people that you meet, you're going to find that half of them are from Saskatchewan anyway. So who knows?
Or Newfoundland.
Or Newfoundland, yeah. It's Alberta, right? So yeah, I think those two are pretty, or three, I guess, are more Prentice. And the thing is, they're going to be conservative. They are going to have conservative ideology. It's whether or not, and Leela here, of course, has been better at really pushing the compassion part of, compassionate conservatism. It does exist. I know, again, some people will disagree with me, but it is also, that is a conservative value. You value the family. You value your parents. You value your children. So you want to make sure that they have whatever they need to, be comfortable or to be successful. It is, an old conservative value. So, that's the way that I put my list together. Now, I'm doing a Zoom with Stephen Carter. He's put together spreadsheets.
Oh, this is the plug
And-
part.
Yes, this is the plug part. Because I even forgot to include it in my newsletter. Like, I'm such an idiot. Anyways, we're doing this on Tuesday, and so people that I trust, I've given the link to, and I'll make a podcast out of it and everything. But he's going to explain something that I think is super important, and that is how people who don't want a particular result inadvertently make it so that that is what happens. So that's a really important thing. I don't know what that is, so I can't give you any insight to that. But that's why I asked him, because this is something that he does, right? So, so we're doing that. Like I said, we're doing that on Tuesday night at 8 p.m. DM me; my DMs are open, and I can probably get you a link. I have no idea how many Zoom participants I can have, but I do pay for it, so I think it's more than a couple. Anyways, but yeah, so like that's a really important part, I think, that people will want to know about before they before they put their ballots in. And I haven't actually even opened mine. Someone sent me a picture of theirs, so I know what they look like, but I wasn't going to open mine until I'm actually sitting with Carter and I get all of this information. So yeah, it's like there are things I don't know for sure, and that's why I've asked him to help out.
I mean, the way that I've kind of, I have no problem saying, because I was advocating it, and I'm speaking purely for myself here, not for anybody else affiliated with the show. But I do believe that, we are, the UCP and the UCP members are going to be choosing the next premier of Alberta. That's an inevitability. Mm-hmm. And I know that I advocated for that on my private social media, and I know that you advocated for it. And I don't have any problem saying that I wanted to have a voice in that. Plus, I had the leftover membership from the leadership race, so I just kind of fell into it anyways. But for me, especially given that it's a preferential ballot, and I think that's the thing that a lot of people are kind of bumping on, like, I just want to vote for that person. And you can do that, but it's only really effective if the person that you're voting for survives the first couple of rounds, because it's kind of like the Thunderdome death match of voting systems, where a bunch of people go in and then one person gets eliminated and then another person gets eliminated, and every time they get eliminated they drop their cool stuff, and whoever else gets to go pick up the cool stuff. So I mean, the way that I'm sort of approaching it is I am taking the approach of, okay, who are the least bad, and I've identified who those two women are for me. And I mean, I'll be totally honest. I'm going to get roasted anyway, so I might as well just go all in. Rajan Sani's my MLA, and I have a lot of issues with, certainly the UCP is 3 years of this program, I hope would make it clear. But one of the things that I've always been able to say about Rajan is that even when we disagree, which is often, she's never lied.
Yeah.
And that's important to me. And the fact that we got this anonymous, well, not anonymous, we know who it is, but we're calling it anonymous because we don't want anyone to get in trouble. But the fact that we got this thing that confirms that not only did she get railroaded on the Aish thing, but that she actually laid down on the tracks and said, the train stops or it drives over me. What do you want to do here, Mr. Premier? That is, you got to respect that. I mean, it didn't get publicized, and obviously cabinet confidence, rana. But, and even then, the fact that she didn't publicize it, I think it shows some integrity. And as a 45-year-old punk rocker, integrity is kind of a big thing for me. I think that Leela here has done an amazing job of trying to push the conversation in directions that we wouldn't have seen it go, given the strategy that we've seen from a lot of the, air quotes, leading candidates. I think she's done a very impressive, and she fights bulls. I mean,
Right?
that alone takes some stones. So, those are, and my third, I've seen some of the modeling that some of the pundits have done, and it looks like it's going to come down to one of the air quotes top three. And so I'm looking at the air quotes top three: Smith, Taves, allegedly this week, Jean, but I don't know. And I'm going, which one's the least bad? I mean, I'm not a fan of any of the top three, and unfortunately I haven't had the opportunity to have any conversations with them because a certain person that you may have alluded to earlier told me where to go. But it's, that's where the third round's going to go. And then if it goes to the fourth, fifth, and sixth round, it is what it is. But it seems like, based on the modeling that some very, very smart people have put forward, that it's going to be very, very, very close. So I'm not going to fill out all 7 on the risk that it could help any of the very, very bad ones. And I'm not going to just sort of pick and choose. But I think that there are some people who have shown some, and again, I know that there's people who are going to hear me saying this, and I'm probably getting mentions already saying like, oh, you're supporting the UCP. No, I'm not. I'm trying to choose the least harmful premier for the next 6 months, because as we saw in the first 6 months of the UCP's reign, they can do a hell of a lot of damage. And when you have people like Smith who are touting the Alberta Sovereignty Act, that every smart person is saying this thing is a train wreck, it's going to friggin' Kenny is saying it's going to destroy the economy. Kenny, who is like the most hyperbolic public speaker in the history of public speakers until Smith came along, it's going to cause real harm. And so for anybody who has a UCP membership, because not that you're supporting the UCP, just because you don't want to see the vulnerable people in this province get rode roughshod on for 6 months, and see the economy destroyed and all of the other things, although I hear we might get Starlink. That's how I'm voting. So that's what I have to say about that. But I mean, really, I'm so done with the argument that if you're participating in this thing, that you're in any way endorsing the UCP. If the NDP were running in this leadership race, or if the Alberta Party were running in this leadership race, or if the Liberals can't put together a leadership race to rub 2 pieces of paper together anyways, but if any of those other people were participating in this leadership race, I might make some different choices. But as it stands, it's purely a question of how many bullets would you like and where would you like them?
Yeah, it is. And, this is, I know that there's been a lot of pushback on participating in this race, participating in the UCP at all. And, I have been pretty consistent since I became politically engaged about trying to get other people politically engaged. And I'm not really concerned so much about what party you're supporting, because I just think that if people are engaged, they'll make better decisions, right? So, and I like to go to the events. I like to talk to people that are there. I like to hear what supporters actually support, and what they feel about things, and why they're there. I don't know. I'm a nerd. I get off on that stuff.
No, I get that. But I just think that, the maxim, decisions are made by those that show up, is true. And if you want to abdicate showing up, you do you. I don't believe that I've condemned anyone for not getting a UCP membership. Somebody's probably going to show me a tweet in like 10 minutes. Oh, you kind of said it here. But I don't believe that I've said, if you don't, you suck. You're a garbage human being. I don't believe that. And why it is...
I've come close.
That's fair.
It was pointed out to me, and I was like, okay, yeah, you're right. That's not fair. So I shouldn't do that.
Well, there you go. But I don't think that anybody should be condemned for trying to be engaged in the democratic process and making the most of the options that are available to themselves. But we got Lynn.
Yeah.
Lynn, what's going on tonight?
Hi, I'm calling you from the north, but not the true north.
Thank you for that.
So I 100% agree with both of you. I did fill out my ballot for the top 3 ladies and not the one from outer space. The question I have for Deidre is, my husband and I had an epic argument last night watching Paula Vu, whatever.
Mm.
And we're on different sides, and I went back to my youth and I said to him, I've been voting your way for a long time, but I've got to base my vote now on my gut.
Mhm.
And I cannot vote for someone that I know that wants to take away my granddaughter's rights or my deceased brother-in-law's gay rights.
Mhm.
And so I'm basing that solely on that. I did my UCP vote in Alberta. My membership is up in November. I will not be renewing it. And I told my husband that Monday morning I'm calling and canceling my PC membership. I just can't. Like, I understand the conservative values. I've been more engaged in the last 4 years than I've ever been in my life. And I cannot vote for people that want to take rights away from women.
Mhm.
And I've never voted Liberal. And I mean, in Alberta, what's the point? But I really feel that as much as being brought up in central Alberta, Trudeau was a dirty word.
Mhm.
My father-in-law was going to disown me at 17 because I participated in a I don't know what it was called back then, but it was a youth exchange, and I got to go to Quebec, and he was just mortified. And at that time, you know, that many years ago, it was bad there. But I really do feel that Trudeau has my back. I don't agree with him running again because I think that Freeland is up next.
Mhm. I agree.
That's my bottom line. I can't vote UCP PC anymore. I just can't.
And that's totally fair. And it's one of the things that I have my own issues with the party as a whole, because I understand more about how parties work now, because I think that people tend to view a political party as, in a way, as some sort of gatekeeping that keeps the party in line or keeps, like, I don't know, like, I just never really had any interest in being a member and didn't really know how they worked, but I just, once I got in and started to see there's so many few people that are actually making decisions, and watching MLAs try to advocate for certain policies or against certain policies and be toasted by the membership, it's a real eye-opener to find
Yes.
that out. And especially when you look at so, like, right now it's a pro-life organization, and they have begun to help organize. So they're helping organize for conservative candidates. I know this, and it does concern me, because in my opinion, the idea that you only need 338 candidates across the country who are pro-life, and we saw this in 2021, 2 of the bills that the Liberals had put forward, and the majority of the CPC caucus voted against them and or for them, whichever it was. I believe it was private members bill to ban sex selective abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And a majority of the CPC members voted for it. So I have to look at the idea that 338 people across the country who happen to all be pro-life, to all run with a blue sign, I don't think that's an impossible feat. And to get 87 candidates across Alberta, I don't think it's an impossible feat. We're not talking about a large number of people. But you get those individuals into the legislature or the House of Commons, and suddenly if they have a majority and they have free votes, we could have a real problem. So
Yes.
like, this is something that you have to, we have to weigh this on a regular basis, that there's more to it than just, I agree with conservative principles, or I don't think conservative principles are necessarily bad. I can have all of those beliefs, and even if the party itself and the majority of people supporting it are completely away from that at this point, I can still say that these things do exist and they're not bad. That doesn't mean that the party suddenly becomes better because they have a conservative sign.
Well, I think part of the problem.
So I mean, it's way more.
I think
than
part of
that.
the
Sorry.
problem fundamentally with the parties, and I would to some degree, based on what we've seen from the gatekeeping that's gone on with the Alberta NDP, I would argue that my grandfather was very politically active. I mean, both of them, but my grandfather on my dad's side in particular was an incredibly politically active guy, and he was a conservative. And I can say with 100% certainty that if he were still around and he looked at what's going on with the UCP and he looked at what's going on with the CPC, he would say, this is not conservatism. This is not what being a conservative means for me. And I think that there's a lot of people in Alberta who, when they take a look at what's actually going on, they go, oh, I didn't know it was like that. There has been I would say, takeover to some degree of the conservative brand, and it's now being used to do something that is completely asynchronous with what those old conservative values used to be. But we got Glenn who's weighing in as well.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. I don't do much of this anymore.
Well, glad you're here with us tonight.
Well, thanks. As far as parties, quote unquote, go, I mean, I spent almost a decade being a member of different parties, doing different things under different leaders. What I've always said is, and this is all I ever say about it, parties are the problem.
Yeah.
That's the issue. I mean, it doesn't matter what level of government you're talking. Parties make the rules. And the last thing they will ever injure is the power of the party. And that's a very select club. And, like everything we've heard about the crazy constituency policy motions that, could be called the rewind to Bible Bill Aberhart bill. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on. That's allowed. But would you guys be okay with winding it back to the UCP leadership vote?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I saw some polling that most everybody saw that I believe showed Trash Can Danny in the lead with 37%, but Taves was less than 10% behind her.
Yes.
Now, with the ranked ballots, we know that anybody who's voting for Danielle number 1 will not have Brian Jean number 2. They'll most likely have Travis Taves. And the same thing for the Brian Jean voters. Now, if you look at the ladies at the rear of the field, Danielle's probably very close to the bottom on their ballots, and they will be the first ones to be amalgamated into the totals. I don't think it's guaranteed that Danielle's going to win, which, yeah, anybody with any common sense says, well, that's good. But have either of you, has anybody had any thoughts that this is just the script anyway? Because I've thought from the very start of this campaign that Danielle and Brian Jean would be way out there, just to see how far they can push the envelope. Of course, the media is doing their part, but how advantageous would it be for the party to have Stockwell Day 2.0, Travis Taves, who I believe Kenny and his masters, that's who they would prefer anyway.
Yeah.
So if Taves manages to pull it out on a third ballot or a fourth ballot, then the media can say, oh, rejoice, Alberta. We have avoided the crazy. We have elected the moderate, and the party is safe to vote for again. What do you think about that?
I mean,
Tyler would like it.
I'm one of the things that I always struggle with these sorts of things is there is, as much as we take a look at the Freedom folks and the Convoy folks and the rationalizations that they've come up with to try to make sense of things, I think that there's just a certain amount of chaos that exists in these situations. And I mean, even looking at the first UCP leadership race, there was one candidate that was part of an orchestrated thing, and everybody else was just doing their own thing. I think that I was flabbergasted that there were 4 leadership candidates that stood up and said, boy, the Sovereignty Act thing, like the fact that they could get 4 of them on the same page, that was really quite something. I have no doubts that there's donors that are donating to multiple candidates. But when it comes to, was Danielle Smith put into is her role in the race to push the envelope? I think Danielle Smith is doing Danielle Smith branding. What she's doing, what she has done with the last couple of years of her radio show. It's the Danielle Smith show. There's nothing dissonant with how she presented herself in the last 2 years of her radio show with what she's doing right now. She's just doing it on a leadership stage. And I think that that's a big part of what we're seeing. But you look like you might have a rebuttal here, Glenn. What do you got?
Well, you mentioned Danielle and the radio show. Well, I mean, this is the same employer that Christy Clark used to do the exact same thing. So, I said that right from the start. She's on the Christy Clark program. But I think something else that nobody is considering that's a very real fact. Danielle Smith is not a sitting member of the Legislative Assembly. So, for her to just say, oh, well, I won, I'll be in the Premier's office tomorrow, it's not quite that simple. And if she wants to introduce this radical legislation, who's going to floor it? Who's going to...
That's easy. That's Casey Madu's job. He's the very bestest poodle. I don't think that there's any. I don't have any doubt that. I mean, what I see happening if Smith wins, God help us all. I think that what we'll probably see is any legislation that she wants introduced will be introduced via Casey Madu, and I think that what we'll probably see from Danielle Smith for the 6 months after October 6th will be the Danielle Smith Roadshow, where she's going to continue doing all of these rallies. She's going to take advantage of she's already said she's not going to run in a by-election. So I think we're going to see the Danielle Smith Roadshow, and she's going to continue doing these rallies and building her brand, because Lord knows that's what she's good at, and she's going to campaign on a lot of these issues. I wouldn't be surprised at all if we saw a pivot after October 6th, and I think I said this last week as well, where Danielle Smith would turn around and say something to the effect of, You know what? I've spoken to caucus, and we agree that we want to make sure that the Alberta Sovereignty Act has all of the power to do the things that I want it to do. And so we agree that this is something that Albertans should vote on. And then she'll make it the election question. And then she'll have 6 months to tour unencumbered from a legislative calendar where she can continue to do what she's done for the last few months. And I think that we're going to see from her the continued Trump show that needs to follow her leadership campaign in order for her to not alienate her base. I think that I've said it for a few months now. What we have seen over the last 2 years is that the fringes have gotten really, really good at being organized. They've gotten really, really good at building networks. APP, Take Back Alberta. And they're organized. And I think that anybody who underestimates that, especially the NDP, does so at not only their own risk, but the risk of the entire province. Because this is not an ad hoc group of folks. They've had 2 years of pandemic campaigning to get really, really good at making people really, really angry. And Danielle Smith has absolutely capitalized on that. And I think that's one of the reasons why she said she's not going to run in a by-election, because if she doesn't, she's got free reign to continue this shit show, but with the added benefit of being the leader of the governing party.
And I
I
think
that's
too. Oh, sorry, Glenn.
I just wanted to say that is an outstanding strategy.
Yep.
But of course, the only thing is, that means she would have to defeat the chosen guy. So we'll see what happens, I guess.
And I think so. There's a couple of scenarios that I've been running through as well, and I looked a little closer at the turn off the taps bill. So that did go to the appeals court, or the Court of Appeals, and basically the decision said, you know, unless Alberta actually acts on this legislation, we can't say whether or not it'll be unconstitutional, because, you know, there's nothing in place right now that will tell us for sure that it is unconstitutional. There's no parameters, there's no regulations, there's nothing. And so they actually said that it was fine that Alberta kept that legislation on the books. Now, when I was reading that, I thought, okay, so here's the scenario about the Alberta Sovereignty Act. I think that what you could see is either, yes, it becomes a ballot question, because a lot of her, well, I don't know if it's a lot, but a few people in caucus are talking about it. Lisa Young did some math, and she said, you know, if Kenny and the four leadership candidates all said we won't vote for this, they still need 15 more MLAs to not support it in order for it to not go through. Now, it's possible that the turn off the taps bill would be unconstitutional if used. Right now, they're allowed to keep it on the books. It did get, I mean, the only person who voted against the turn off the taps bill was David Swan, former Liberal Party leader. He's the only one who voted against it. All of the NDP MLAs voted for it. All of the UCP MLAs that were in the legislature in 2018 all voted for it. So they have no problem voting for potentially unconstitutional legislation. None of them do.
Well, you're not wrong.
Right? They don't have a problem with that. They have a problem with this particular legislation. But I don't know. I mean, Danielle Smith, unfortunately, like you said, she lies a lot. So on the one hand, she says, well, you know, the Sovereignty Act would be used very rarely. And on the other hand, she says, well, we could use it for all of these things because it's magic. But the thing is, if they decided to put it into legislation and pass it in the legislature, if the Governor General gives it the assent that it needs. And they could essentially, based on what has happened with the turn off the taps bill and the appeal and everything, the challenge that went against this, they could shelve it. They don't actually have to do anything with it, and they can say, hey, look, everybody, we did it. We passed this legislation.
I bet,
and it
though,
could sit there.
I bet, though, that would be. I mean, I'm going to throw it to Zad real quick here because we're running out of time. We're coming up to the 2-hour mark again. But I would be willing to bet that if Danielle Smith and Team UCP passed the Alberta Sovereignty Act before a general election, that would be a gift in so many ways to the NDP. But I think that it would also be one of the things where maybe Mr. Trudeau would be like, let's see what you do with this. And I can see him very easily blocking something that would put Smith in a position where, as premier in the wings, I guess, she would be forced to either do something or not. And I think that it would, if she did something, well, there's your legal challenge. If she didn't do something, well, there's your base running away and forming a new political party in the last months of the preamble to the general election. But Zad, how's it going tonight? Never mind.
We lost him.
He had his hand up and everything, and then as soon as I said, he ran away. So that's okay. My feeling, it's just feelings. They'll grow back. Oh, we're back again. Musical chairs. Let's see. Are we working now?
Yeah, sorry about that. I was bouncing back and forth between Wi-Fi and cellular. So
as long as it's not me.
Been there.
No, I actually wanted to add a bit to your point. Not very much, because there's some very smart and civically engaged people on this spaces. And I just wanted to say one of the effects that got magnified by the pandemic is that some of these fringe efforts have looked bigger than they are because of their use of social media. And because of the pandemic and the lack of face-to-face interactions at the doors and the lack of rallies and meetings, this social media amplified fringe belief is viewed as bigger than it really is. And I think an example of that is about 3 weeks ago, there was a survey in the United States that found that the actual support for climate change is around 70% for mitigating climate change. But the perceived support is only about 35%. And so this is one of the ways in which the pandemic's lack of interaction with people has allowed social media to magnify fringe ideas. Okay, that's all.
Awesome.
No, and you're absolutely right. And I will use a recent example. Derek Sloan running for the whatever his new weird party was in Banff Airdrie in the last election, and he held a rally on the first night, and I watched it online. The room was packed. There were so many people there. As it turns out, Sloan got a very, very low number of votes in the actual election. And the reason that there was such a disparity is because people came from all over southern Alberta to attend that rally. Unfortunately, they couldn't actually vote for him when the time came. So, again, you look at, wow, there's all of a sudden a lot of support for Derek Sloan in Banff Airdrie. Could this be bad? Could he actually get elected in Alberta? Nope, he couldn't. Because you're right, Syed, there's a very few, it's actually a few people that will gather together in one space, but they are they're very spread out. They're spread out, and there's honestly not really more of them than there ever has been, right?
I don't know about that, and I only say that. I mean, I agree. It's a small number. It's going to be. We're going to find out on October 6th if it's enough to elect a new leader to the UCP.
Right.
But the one of the things that I kind of keep going back to that I really don't want to underestimate is when you take a look at history, the most destabilizing moments in the body politic of any society have always occurred after a major sustained disaster or catastrophe. That's when people are the most, and I've done this bit before, but that's when people are the most, they're feeling so desperately out of control that they will attach themselves to just about anything that gives them the sense of, whether or not it's real or illusion, of control. And I really worry, based on purely anecdotal and in no way data supported ways, but with conversations with people that I've had in my life. Like, I've had conversations with people whom I was shocked to find out were, oh, the WEF, they want us all to eat worms or something. And I'm like, I'm a vegetarian. But
Crickets.
yeah, but I mean, A, people already do that, so whatever. But B, that's been coming from people that pre-pandemic, I have a fairly high level of confidence would have gone, well, that sounds and smells a lot like bullshit. But I think that things have become so destabilized and people have such a sense of being out of control for such a sustained period that underestimating what that can do given the lessons of history is, it's a risk.
Yeah.
Deirdre,
Absolutely.
anything you want to end the night with? Because I got 2 kids I got to put to bed.
Yeah. So I guess, like I said, I gave you a plug for the ballot thing with Carter that I'm doing on Tuesday, and I guess just keep paying attention. Lots of stuff going on.
There we go. Yeah, and I agree. And if there's a reason why the breakdown exists, it's because we're trying to find little ways to help people get more engaged, and we'll use any legal means necessary to do so, up to and including puppets, which we're percolating on a new thing. And I would say again, we've committed that whoever the UCP leadership victor is, they're going to get more than the sock. They're going to get the right, proper, not Jason Kenney treatment. It's going to require some materials. Here comes my plug. So one of the reasons why we're able to do all the things that we do at the show, including make high-end puppets, is because of the support that we get from our Patreon sponsors. So if you appreciate the kind of content that we're doing, if you appreciate the puppets, if you want to see what that new puppet's going to look like in stunning plaster of Paris, then you can sign up to be one of our Patreon supporters at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab. You get early access to our interview episodes, and the warm, fuzzy feeling that comes from knowing that you're contributing to something that you like. We don't do ads. We don't do Patreon-only content, because if you're going to try to foster conversations, making it exclusive is kind of against the ethos, for us at least. But we do appreciate all the support that we get. If you're listening to this, well, first of all, I want to say thank you to everybody who participated tonight, especially to our speakers. I want to say thank you to everybody who listened and just kind of lurked. There's some super, as I pointed out, there's some super smart people in the audience who are listening, and the fact that they're not throwing internet-sized rocks at the things that we've been saying here gives me warm fuzzies. So I want to say thank you to everybody who has been listening or pretending to listen and just stuck your phone in the drawer. It's still good for my ego. I want to say thank you to everybody who's listening to the podcast version of this or watching the live stream. We did get a couple of comments on our chat tonight. I want to say thank you to Angie, Wally, and PK. Thanks for throwing the comments in the chat. We're trying to grow our chat section a little bit, and we're going to be posting the link for our Discord publicly, probably tomorrow if I remember to do it. If you're listening to the podcast version of this, leave a rating, leave a comment, leave a little 5 stars if you can. Helps get the podcast in front of more people. And I think that's all of my housekeeping that I need to do. Thank you again, everybody. We will see you next week. And actually, before we go, I have one ask that I want to throw out there. If anybody has any DMs, one of the things that we're wanting to do this year is we want to try to facilitate a bit of a roundtable around September 30th and Orange Shirt Day, particularly given the events that we've seen over the last little while. So if anybody knows anybody who might be willing to engage in a conversation, who's from the First Nations communities, who has some things that they wish that more people heard, send us a DM, because we want to try to make that as accessible as possible. I want to say a big thank you to everybody again. Take care of yourselves, be kind, and keep the conversation going.